In the early 1800s, what began as rumors of disappearances led investigators into a system so organized, so methodical, that it blurred the line between commerce and cruelty. This is the documented record of the Sullivan Case, an investigation that exposed how the powerful hid their crimes beneath respectability. Every account you're about to hear was drawn from official reports, trial documents, and forgotten archives. The first official record concerning the Sullivan property appears in the county docket, dated April 17, 1834. Sheriff Benjamin Crawford, acting on multiple reports of missing children from 2 adjoining townships, was instructed to inspect the estate situated 8 miles north of the town of Millston, Virginia. The order, signed by Magistrate Elijah Rowe, described the property as a timber farmhouse with surrounding acreage formerly used for tobacco cultivation. The warrant cited no expectation of foul play, merely a need to confirm the well-being of laborers said to be employed there. What was recorded afterward altered the vocabulary of the local courts for decades. According to the sheriff's field memorandum, the inspection party consisted of 5 men, Crawford himself, 2 deputies, a township constable, and a physician summoned to verify sanitary conditions. They arrived at 09:40 a.m. Weather, overcast. Temperature estimated at 51 degrees Fahrenheit. Livestock pens appeared empty, the fields unworked for an estimated 2 seasons. The main dwelling showed signs of habitation, smoke residue in the hearth, tools on the porch, stored grain in barrels, but no inhabitants were immediately visible. The inspection began with standard entry protocol, calling out the property owner's name, receiving no response, and proceeding through the front door under warrant authority. The first floor was found orderly but abandoned. Crockery on the table contained remnants of recent meals. A single ledger rested on the mantel. Its first page marked household accounts. Deputies noted faint vibration in the floorboards beneath the kitchen area, described as the sound of movement below. Upon investigation, they located an irregular gap in the planking near the hearth. A concealed iron latch was discovered, fastened by a padlock later removed with tools. Beneath it, a ladder, extended downward into darkness. The following entry in Crawford's handwriting states only, "Opened subcellar, air foul, voices detected, indeterminate number." From this point, all observations were made under lantern light. The substructure measured roughly 32 feet by 16 feet, with a ceiling height of less than 6 feet. Walls composed of fieldstone and packed earth bore traces of lime wash applied irregularly. Along the northern wall ran a wooden beam fitted with iron rings. Chains were affixed to several of these rings, each ending in crude shackles, sized for small wrists or ankles. Bedding consisted of straw-filled sacks, placed at intervals of 2 to 3 feet. One corner contained a tin pail, presumed for sanitation purposes. Another held empty water jugs. Illumination came from a single oil lamp suspended on wire. The official count of recovered persons was recorded at 47. Ages, as estimated by the attending physician, ranged from approximately 6 to 15 years. Their identities were not immediately verifiable. Each was described as in advanced state of neglect. Medical notes summarized: body weight below expected norms, skin abrasion consistent with contact pressure at limb restraints, vision affected by light deprivation. No further physical details were entered in the first report. Subsequent examinations were documented elsewhere. Communication with the subjects was limited. Several were capable of stating given names. Many responded to numeric identifiers marked on linen tags attached to garments. Crawford's later testimony before the district court clarified the sequence of actions. He ordered the removal of all restraints before transport. Deputies catalogued physical evidence: 9 chains, 12 iron rings, 5 wooden pallets, 1 ledger, and 3 locks. Items were placed in sealed crates labeled Exhibit AF. The sheriff's report emphasized procedural order rather than emotion. Subjects extracted without incident. Physician recommends immediate conveyance to the county infirmary. Premises secured at 14:20 hours. Outside, local residents had gathered, drawn by the commotion. Statements from these witnesses were later compiled. One farmer claimed the Sullivans were quiet folk who kept to themselves. Another recalled hearing children's voices near the creek at dusk, but assumed it to be travellers. The lack of earlier suspicion was attributed to the property's isolation and to community reluctance to interfere with what was considered private enterprise. No one questioned the absence of the Sullivan family that morning. It was concluded they had fled sometime during the previous night. The discovery reached Richmond papers within 3 days. The Virginia Courier, issue of April 20th, printed a single paragraph titled, "Unusual Circumstances in Millstone County." It referred only to a group of miners discovered in unlawful confinement. National attention followed once federal marshals became involved. By late May, the incident was referenced in congressional correspondence as the Sullivan Case. At that stage, the narrative transformed from local event to matter of state record, though the surviving documents preserve its original scale and ordinariness. A small rural raid yielding evidence of a far-reaching system. Subsequent inventories provide additional context about the environment in which the children were kept. Analysis of soil and wall samples in transportation of the recovered miners commenced the same evening. Wagons borrowed from neighboring farms carried them to the county infirmary 20 miles south. The procession departed at sunset under escort. Crawford's final field note for the day records environmental data, barometric reading, wind direction, and the number of guards assigned, as if to ensure that the account remained beyond dispute. He ended the page with one spare observation. No sound from cellar upon closure. What followed was the bureaucratic phase that inevitably accompanies tragedy once it enters the administrative record. Clerks compiled name estimates, measured heights, weighed each subject, and attempted to cross-reference local disappearance notices. Only 4 identifications were confirmed within the first week. The remaining 43 were designated unverified. Each received a file bearing the county seal and a sequential code. In later years, those files would become fragments in the larger Sullivan investigation, yet this first compilation is the foundation, the moment when the nameless were converted into recordable entities within government custody. Crawford submitted his complete report on April 26, 1834. It runs 12 pages and contains no personal commentary. The closing section, titled Observations, includes 3 sentences. 1. Basement structure intentionally concealed. Chapter 2. Evidence of long-term habitation below standard human conditions. 3. Origin of confinement is indeterminate at present. The absence of conclusion is notable. He neither hypothesized motive nor named accomplices. His restraint established the tone for every document that followed. In the months that ensued, public reaction intensified, but within official archives the event remained static, preserved through reports, measurements, and signatures rather than outrage. Later investigators examining the same site would remark on the lack of personal expression in early documentation. No adjectives, no moral condemnation, only coordinates and inventories. That neutrality, though often criticized, ensured that the record survived political revision. The physical remnants of the Sullivan cellar were dismantled by order of the court in 1835. Bricks and timbers were transported to a county yard and catalogued as evidence. 3 specimens of chain iron were retained for metallurgical testing. The rest were destroyed. Photographic technology being unavailable, the sole visual record consists of 2 ink sketches commissioned for judicial proceedings. These drawings, preserved in the Richmond State Archive, remain the definitive representation of the basement. Each is captioned with a simple description. View of substructure, north wall, and view of substructure, south aspect. By the year's end, the official summary issued to the governor's office distilled the matter into a single paragraph of bureaucratic prose. Inspection of Sullivan property, Millstone County, conducted April 17th and 19th, 1834, yielded 47 juvenile persons held without sanction. Investigation ongoing. Responsible parties absent. Federal coordination advised. That paragraph closes the first volume of the case file. Everything that came afterward, the identification attempts, the pursuit of accomplices, the discovery of wider commerce, was appended under separate headings. Yet the opening entry, plain and procedural, remains the nucleus of the entire record. One cellar, 47 children, a sheriff performing his duty, and a community confronted by the realization that systematic cruelty had existed undetected at its center. Thus ends the preserved account known as the Basement Discovery. It contains no speculation, no reconstruction, only the measurable facts as written by those who stepped beneath the farmhouse floor and saw what was there. The following volumes, compiled in subsequent years, would reveal that the cellar was merely one chamber in a structure extending far beyond Millstone County, an origin point for correspondences, transactions, and names that would surface again under the heading The Sullivan Network. Following the 1871 raid, officials began assembling records from the Sullivan property, ledgers, receipts, and fragments of correspondence, to reconstruct how nearly 5 decades of captivity had persisted in rural Virginia. The collected evidence formed what investigators later labeled the system of obedience. It described a closed institution whose procedures were designed to produce compliance through deprivation, isolation, and reward. The inquiry identified Constant Sullivan as the architect of the system and his wife Martha Sullivan as its keeper of order. Surviving documentation shows that between 1834 and 1871, the couple acquired children from several sources: county orphan registries, workhouses, and traveling intermediaries who supplied indentured labor. The Sullivans maintained the facade of an agricultural charity for the destitute, offering care in exchange for work. Official inspection records were few. The remoteness of the property ensured that oversight was nominal. The first tier of control began with separation. Newly arrived children were not placed among the others immediately. They were recorded, assigned an identification number, and kept apart in unlit rooms until what the ledgers termed adjustment. Surviving pages specify durations of 3 to 7 days, with minimal rations and restricted movement. The practice's stated purpose was to test endurance and silence. The authorities noted that this process appeared to erase most resistance by the time subjects were introduced to the collective dormitory. Once integrated, a second structure emerged, a hierarchy of monitors and laborers. Older captives were given marginal privileges, additional food portions, limited time outdoors, or permission to read from salvaged hymnals. In return, they enforced compliance among the younger ones. The surviving testimonies describe these monitors as both. The investigators catalogued a doctrine of containment preserved in a ledger dated 1852, titled Book of Continuance. The entries list 68 names, ages, and remarks such as unfit for release or adjusted. Several marginal notes bear abbreviations like BO, later interpreted as broken order. The consistent use of administrative terminology, rather than personal descriptors, suggests the couple considered the captives not as individuals, but as components of a system requiring maintenance. During the judicial inquiry, surviving children were interviewed under the supervision of medical officers. The transcripts reveal patterns of speech consistent with conditioning. Many addressed adults using the formal title guardian, regardless of identity. Several expressed reluctance to leave the premises, citing a belief that the world outside rejects us. Investigators concluded that prolonged isolation had created a self-sustaining ideology in which captivity equaled safety. Economic motives were also documented. Account books showed that the Sullivan farm produced textiles and wooden crafts sold to local merchants. Labor was attributed to students, concealing its source. The profits financed expansions of the cellar structure, additional chambers, improved ventilation, and reinforced doors. Architects examining the site found workmanship suggesting assistance from skilled craftsmen unaware of the building's true purpose. The inquiry's final report, filed by Sheriff Benjamin Crawford in 1873, described the environment in language stripped of sentiment. A system of perpetual instruction, whereby obedience is conditioned by measured sustenance and seclusion. He added a notation that the method appeared self-perpetuating. Older participants became instructors to the younger, preserving the rules without direct oversight. Medical assessors noted physiological effects consist with long-term confinement but avoided conjecture regarding psychological states. The official record emphasizes procedure. how rules were enforced, how hierarchies rotated, how silence was maintained during nocturnal hours. Each observation ends with the phrase, "as recorded, not inferred." Through these documents emerges an image of a household transformed into an institution without charter, operating under the illusion of moral reform. Sullivan's correspondence to regional authorities invoked religious justification, quoting scripture about discipline and purity. His tone mirrored that of contemporary reform schools, lending his enterprise an air of legitimacy. The deception proved effective. Until the raid, the property was considered a model of rural industriousness. Investigators later traced the conceptual framework to earlier charitable experiments in the 1820s, when urban philanthropists advocated strict discipline for orphaned youth. Sullivan, once employed as a clerk in such a program, may have replicated its regimen in isolation. The phrase "breaking in," found repeatedly in his notes, echoed the period's rhetoric about moral correction. Thus the Sullivan case was not entirely anomalous. It reflected an extreme continuation of accepted 19th-century theories of reform through obedience. By 1874, the Commission on Domestic Institutions compiled a 312-page dossier combining witness accounts, confiscated writings, and physical inventories. The document remains the most complete record of controlled isolation practices in a private setting during that century. Scholars later debated whether the Sullivan system represented deliberate malice or misguided application of institutional discipline. The official stance remained neutral. Intent unascertained, outcome verified. Among the collected materials, one set of notes differs from the rest. Written in a child's hand, it lists names followed by brief marks resembling tallies. The page ends with the line, "Those who remember must teach the small ones not to forget." Authorities could not identify the writer, but the handwriting was traced to one of the older captives, a girl named Rebecca L., recorded as 15 at the time of the raid. The presence of this note, found hidden inside the Book of Continuance, suggested an awareness of the system's structure and an intent to preserve memory rather than obedience. Rebecca's inclusion in later hearings revealed the first internal resistance documented within the Sullivan hierarchy. Her testimony, limited, cautious, and heavily redacted, hinted that communication among the captives had persisted despite restrictions. The Commission cited her as the anomaly that rendered the structure unstable. The report concludes, "Where obedience becomes the measure of virtue, remembrance becomes defiance." This final line, appended by an unknown clerk, would later serve as the thematic closing to the official record of the Sullivan investigation. After the Sullivan property was sealed, officials began the slow process of recording survivor statements. Most were fragmented, phrases repeated, dates confused, but one account remained unusually precise. It belonged to Rebecca L., age 14, taken from rural Pennsylvania 5 years earlier. Her words, preserved through dictated depositions and sworn affidavits, provided the first coherent map of the network that had sustained Constant Sullivan's operations. Rebecca's initial statement was taken in Richmond, January 1872, before a panel of magistrates and medical officers. The transcript, filed under Commonwealth v. Sullivan et al. Volume 2, opens with her recollection of the journey that brought her south. She recalled leaving her home to follow a man who promised employment at a boarding school. The record notes her phrasing. He said they teach sewing and reading for girls who have lost their fathers. The testimony lists the point of departure, Lancaster County, Pennsylvania, and a date corresponding with the disappearance reports filed there 2 weeks later. Investigators matched her description of the conveyance, a closed wagon bearing the initials HC on its rear panel, to transportation manifests found at a toll station near the Virginia line. The driver was registered as Harold Colden, a merchant operating under temporary license. Receipts recovered from the Sullivan property later contained entries signed HC for the delivery of packages. The correlation between these initials marked the first documented link between the farm and out-of-state abductions. During the Richmond sessions, Rebecca gave a structured account of internal operations rather than personal impressions. The clerks recorded her insistence on chronological order, dates, names, and markings she had memorized. She stated that new arrivals were entered into a book kept by Mrs. Sullivan. Their columns were labeled with single letters, N, R, and C. Investigators interpreted these as shorthand for new, ready, and cleared. The terminology suggested a process extending beyond the farm itself. Rebecca described periodic visits from men whose attire and speech indicated urban residents. They inspected records, conversed privately with Sullivan, and departed with sealed ledgers. No physical exchange occurred in her presence, but she noted that certain children disappeared soon afterward. The pattern matched entries in the recovered account books, where initials corresponded to shipment dates and payments received through intermediaries in Richmond. Among her most significant contributions was a list of surnames she overheard during these visits: Colden, Ashbury, Kerr, Rothwell, none of which appeared in local census rolls, but were later found in banking registries and charitable trust documents. This discovery expanded the investigation from a single property to a network of farms and institutions spread across 3 states. The depositions reveal that Rebecca had developed a habit of counting days by candle burns and tracking events by the sequence of deliveries. Her memory produced a timeline covering nearly 60 months. Each entry, harvests, repairs, visits, was cross-checked against commercial records, confirming accuracy within days. The precision of her recollection gave the inquiry its structural backbone. When questioned about her reasons for memorizing such details, Rebecca answered in the brief form typical of the transcript. Someone had to remember in case the silence ended. No further elaboration was recorded. The clerks noted that she referred to the other children by initials only. This manner of speaking was consistent with the notation system found in Sullivan's ledgers. By adopting it, she had effectively mirrored the administrator's record-keeping, an inadvertent safeguard that allowed investigators to match human names to coded symbols. Cross-examination shifted to the topic of external correspondence. Rebecca recalled a man addressed by Sullivan as Doctor, who visited twice yearly. He carried measuring instruments and sealed vials. The commission later identified him as Dr. Elias Rothwell, a physician associated with several orphan charities. Freight invoices confirmed his travel between Baltimore and Richmond during the cited years. This link demonstrated that the Sullivan operation functioned under the guise of philanthropy, with reputable patrons providing protection and resources. Rebecca's deposition filled 64 handwritten pages. Each line bears marginal annotations by the investigators, translating her recollections into logistical data: transport routes, purchase records, aliases. The methodology of the inquiry changed after her testimony, from moral condemnation to administrative mapping. She transformed the case from a singular atrocity into evidence of a commerce system embedded within reform institutions. The commission appended to her file a map drawn from her description of the property. It shows multiple cellar rooms connected by narrow corridors and a surface structure labeled office. Inside that room, she reported seeing bundles of correspondence bearing wax seals marked with initials ER and WM. When compared to surviving D documents from a Richmond charity warehouse, identical seals were found on crates labeled educational materials. Investigators traced one of those crates to a secondary property near Charleston, operated by a man named Wesley Marden. Receipts confirmed shipments between the 2 locations over a 7-year period. Thus, through Rebecca's recollection alone, the network's geography expanded hundreds of miles beyond Virginia. The language of the official report remains austere. It avoids adjectives, relying on quantitative assessment, numbers of visits, distance between sites, intervals between recorded shipments. Yet within these dry statistics, the magnitude of the operation becomes apparent. In the concluding section of the deposition, Rebecca identified certain symbols used in the ledgers: a circle for male, a triangle for female, a cross beside those removed from the property. Her recognition enabled decoding of the remaining records. This discovery turned the Sullivan Archive into a national reference point for investigating missing child reports across the eastern states. When the hearings adjourned, the presiding judge commended her precision, noting that the witness speaks not from imagination, but from retained observation of procedure. The record lists her afterward as Protective Custody Number 11. Beyond that point, documentation of her life disappears. Following the Richmond hearings, the Commission on Institutional Conduct directed its attention to a name that recurred throughout both the Sullivan ledgers and Rebecca's testimony, Henry Blackwood. Until that point, the investigation had been confined to one rural property. Blackwood's inclusion changed its scale entirely. His estate, recorded in agricultural registries as Blackwood Plantation and Research Grounds, occupied over 600 acres near Charleston. To local society, he was regarded as a philanthropist, founder of the Blackwood Benevolent Foundation, a patron of orphanage construction, and a financier of several medical colleges in the South. The first indication of complicity appeared in correspondence seized from the Sullivan property. 2 letters, dated 1869 and 1870, carried Blackwood's signature. Their tone was businesslike, the handwriting precise, the language coded. Each letter referred to deliveries under the educational grant and requested that subjects meet previously established conditions. Investigators noted that the phrasing mirrored commercial purchase orders rather than charitable communication. In March 1872, a team led by Inspector Alden Reeve was dispatched to Charleston under orders to audit the Blackwood estate. What they found was less a plantation and more a compound, a network of facilities labeled workshops, testing rooms, and archives. Each structure bore signs of systematic record-keeping. Every activity was logged, every expense justified. The first inventory list alone filled 87 pages, encompassing agricultural equipment, imported materials, and an array of apparatus registered under the vague heading Demonstration Instruments. Interviews with employees revealed that the Blackwood Foundation had for years received students from out-of-state reform institutions. The stated objective was moral rehabilitate. In his public statement, Blackwood maintained that the Foundation's work concerned the study of endurance and human variability in agricultural environments. He emphasized its philanthropic motive, training the destitute for disciplined rural labor. Yet when pressed for enrollment records, he produced none. The Commission's request for donor lists was likewise refused, Blackwood citing privacy clauses in the Foundation's charter. The audit uncovered significant financial irregularities. Between 1865 and 1870, the Blackwood Foundation received over $78,000 in research contributions, yet disbursed less than 1/10 of that amount to legitimate educational projects. The remainder vanished through offshore accounts in Nassau and Halifax, transactions conducted through the firm Kerr Rothwell, already cited in Sullivan's correspondence. Testimony from a dismissed servant provided additional insight. The witness, whose name was withheld for safety, recalled shipments arriving at night under armed escort. The crates bore no agricultural markings. When questioned about their contents, staff were instructed to remain silent. The same witness reported that the north wing of the main building was sealed to all but Blackwood and his chosen assistants. Sounds described as mechanical work were heard at irregular hours. In June 1872, federal officers executed a warrant for seizure of records. Blackwood resisted, producing letters of endorsement from several high-ranking officials who praised his charitable efforts. The delay allowed substantial evidence to disappear. Several offices were found burned or emptied. Nevertheless, surviving materials filled 23 crates. Among them was correspondence with multiple estates across the South, each referencing educational consignments and moral restoration programs. When analyzed collectively, these letters mapped a network of at least 7 cooperating sites. The language was consistent: shipments, requirements, adjustments, and remittances. The phrasing stripped humanity from its subjects, reducing individuals to categories of compliance. In his summary, Inspector Reeve wrote, "The tone suggests commerce thinly disguised as benevolence, operating through institutions immune to moral scrutiny. Public awareness came only after fragments of the investigation were leaked to the Charleston Chronicle. The resulting article, published August 1872, ignited brief outrage before being suppressed by legal injunction. Witnesses who attempted to testify were discredited as unstable or coerced into silence. Several members of the commission resigned, citing external pressure. The remaining officials transferred proceedings to Washington under the title Committee for Philanthropic Oversight. Despite obstruction, the inquiry proceeded. By early 1873, it had compiled a 400-page report detailing the foundation's structure. Sections were devoted to financial conduits, property transfers, and the manipulation of charity laws. The report concluded that Blackwood's organization maintained facilities inconsistent with educational purpose and engaged in practices contrary to natural and civil codes. Legal counsel later rephrased this as conduct unbecoming of a citizen and violation of trust. Blackwood himself never stood trial. A fatal carriage accident in late 1873 ended the case prematurely. His estate passed to distant relatives, and much of the documentation vanished in subsequent years. The Commission's report remained sealed until 1911, when excerpts resurfaced in a congressional review of 19th-century welfare institutions. What remained undisputed was the pattern. Children and young laborers moved through charitable channels, stripped of identity, absorbed into a system that presented exploitation as reform. The Blackwood case revealed how institutional language, education, science, progress could conceal exploitation behind administrative respectability. Among the seized papers, investigators discovered a single letter without salutation or signature, written in an unfamiliar hand. It read simply, "To forget the ledger is to repeat its lesson. The cost of silence is the continuation of order." The handwriting matched that of a former Blackwood accountant who disappeared during the inquiry. The same hand would later appear in documents linked to another estate north of Savannah, the next site under investigation. The inquiry into the Blackwood Foundation entered a decisive phase in April 1874, when a new witness appeared before the Committee for Philanthropic Oversight. His name was Samuel J. Pierce, former overseer and operations manager at the Blackwood estate between 1859 and 1872. Until that moment, Pierce had avoided public scrutiny, his resignation attributed to health deterioration. What he disclosed transformed the investigation from a financial audit into a record of systematic abuse. Pierce presented a series of handwritten journals spanning more than a decade of estate activity. Each entry followed the same format: date, assignment, number of subjects, and completion status. Beneath the plain accounting style lay the outlines of a program concealed beneath agricultural terminology. In testimony transcribed on April 16, 1874, Pierce stated, "We were instructed that certain quarters were not to be entered except by the physicians. The place was known internally as the East Wing, but in private correspondence, they called it the experimental quarters. My duties kept me near the lower fields, yet I often saw the carriages arrive at night, covered wagons bearing the initials of Charleston Medical College." He described a wing partitioned from the rest of the estate, equipped with locked rooms, tiled floors, and wash basins, unlike any used for agriculture. The quarters were administered jointly by Dr. Alistair G. Rothwell and Dr. Jonathan Keene, both licensed physicians affiliated with Charleston Medical College. Their official purpose, as filed in 1867, was nutrition and environmental endurance study for industrial education. Pierce's account detailed procedures that extended far beyond observation. Subjects were exposed to prolonged confinement, temperature extremes, and deliberate exposure to substances identified only as T compound, red solution, and samples. Investigators traced the delivery sites mentioned in Pierce's journals and the buyer's ledger. Charleston, South Carolina, Blackwood Quarters, described as testing wing adjoining Plantation Manor. Witnesses noted tiled corridors, locked cellars, and examination tables imported from Germany. Invoice dated 1869. Richmond, Virginia. Sullivan Annex, abandoned warehouse near Dock Street, used for short-term holding prior to transfer northward. Local residents recalled wagons arriving at dusk, no registration numbers visible. Baltimore, Maryland. Rothwell Company facility, now demolished. Records indicated demonstration evenings attended by select patrons from medical and mercantile circles. Coded invitations used symbols resembling pharmaceutical emblems. Alexandria, Virginia, Lang Storage Depot. Functioned as shipping intermediary for educational consignments. Customs logs list cargoes of cloth, machinery, and glassware, weights inconsistent with declarations. Savannah, Georgia, Greer House. Later identified as correspondence hub linking the estates. Several encrypted notes from Pierce's journals refer to letters southbound via Greer. Transactions often concluded with cash settlements in sealed envelopes or promissory notes exchanged under false corporate names. The committee's 1875 memorandum described these activities as a parallel economy in human commerce conducted under philanthropic disguise. During his second deposition on May 3, 1874, Pierce expanded upon the relationship between the Blackwood Foundation and the Charleston Medical College. He claimed that medical students and licensed doctors were periodically invited to observe endurance demonstrations. Participants were presented as case material, and data were compiled for private circulation, never entering academic publication. He read directly from one of his own entries. June 14, 1871. 2 physicians from Charleston attended. One instructed to record pulse and respiration. Subject unresponsive after prolonged exposure to heat. Not revived. Physician marked results as useful. When asked what became of the deceased, Pierce hesitated before responding. They were taken to the cellar. The bodies were placed in crates labeled medical returns. I was told those shipments were sent to the college for instruction. The committee's internal report, classified until 1903, later confirmed the existence of such crates in Charleston College archives, unregistered, unclaimed, and destroyed in a 1901 fire. Pierce's revelations marked the last major disclosure before the Commission's dissolution in 1876. His testimony was deemed emotionally compromised and partially redacted from the final report. Yet fragments of his journals survived in private collections, resurfacing during the 1911 welfare reforms that briefly revisited 19th-century institutional practices. Scholars later noted that Pierce's diction, precise, emotionless, and dated, reflected both guilt and self-preservation. He did not position himself as a whistleblower, but as a man seeking to complete the record. One final note appears at the end of his journal, undated. I believed we were improving the species. Now I know we were dismantling it. The earliest organized event described by Samuel Pierce was dated June 17, 1871, though he referred to it by its internal designation, the demonstration. According to his written account, it took place in the central courtyard of the Blackwood estate, 3 miles east of Charleston, South Carolina. The purpose, as stated in a private circular sent to invitees, was to exhibit newly conditioned youth suitable for adoption, instruction, or labor under private guardianship. The Blackwood Circular, preserved in the committee archives, listed 27 attendees from across the southern and mid-Atlantic states, planters, physicians, and industrial representatives. The document, printed on embossed parchment and sealed with the Blackwood crest, presented the event as a philanthropic exhibition. Yet every line of Pierce's testimony revealed its actual function, a commercial display of human subjects. They called it the demonstration because it was meant to show what order and training could achieve. The guests arrived before noon. I was ordered to prepare the lower quarters and ensure that all subjects were dressed alike and silent. The subjects, as Pierce described them, were 31 children, aged between 6 and 15, each wearing plain linen garments marked only by a number at the collar. They were assembled in 3 lines across the courtyard. The display began with a reading of instructional metrics, during which the overseer, identified as Miles Deering, announced each child's recorded endurance level, literacy capacity, and obedience rating. At intervals, buyers were encouraged to step forward, inspect posture, and issue commands. Notes from investigator E.L. Hargrave's transcript, 1875, record that certain participants conducted tests of compliance, involving verbal orders and simple physical tasks. The transactions that followed were recorded as donations, each accompanied by sealed agreements prepared by Clerk Thomas Wainwright. The attendance ledger, recovered from the remnants of Pierce's journals, lists notable individuals later identified by investigators: Henry Blackwood, estate host; Dr. Alistair Rothwell, Charleston Medical College; Dr. Jonathan Keene, associate physician; Councilman R.T. Harrow, Maryland Assembly; Merchant B.L. Wainwright, Charleston; Industrialist A.V. Pendleton, Norfolk; Captain F.T. Lang, Alexandria; Sheriff M.D. Colson, Abbeville County; Judge Erasmus Fenn, Savannah Circuit Court; Reverend Wallace Greer, formerly of the South Carolina Diocesan Board. The list reflected both wealth and authority. Each signatory occupied positions capable of influencing law enforcement, trade permits, and educational institutions. The presence of judicial and religious figures provided the appearance of legitimacy. The event was structured into 3 phases: inspection, demonstration, and allocation. During inspection, attendees reviewed the conditioned youth one by one. The demonstration phase presented obedience trials. Finally, allocation involved written pledges and scheduled transfers. Pierce's notes specified 20 orders placed on the day of the event, with estimated values ranging between £200 and $800 per subject. No money changed hands publicly. Transactions were finalized in the Manor Library under the guise of charitable sponsorship. The 1875 Commission located fragments of estate correspondence confirming the event's organization. A letter dated May 22, 1871, from Blackwood to Rothwell reads, "Ensure readiness of all participants by the 17th. Guests will arrive by private road. Prepare the demonstration as agreed. Keep papers sealed until after dusk." Another note, from Dr. Keene to A.V. Pendleton, referred to the endurance display, emphasizing the importance of discretion. Please avoid mention of the trials in public. The value is in the appearance of progress, not in the detail. The Charleston Register, edition of June 19, 1871, carried a small column titled "Charitable Exhibition at the Blackwood Estate." The article referred vaguely to youths of orphan status demonstrating agricultural aptitude. No mention was made of transactions, nor of the 31 children later unaccounted for. When the Commission revisited this record in 1875, the newspaper's editorial staff denied prior knowledge of any irregularity. The surviving press clipping, preserved in the National Archives, File 47C 1975, became the only public trace of the event. The Commission's first attempt to execute a warrant on the Sullivan property, believed to be linked to Blackwood through correspondence, was issued on September 11, 1874. Sheriff Benjamin Crawford, the original Discover. An internal memorandum from Federal Marshal Edwin T. Clark reads, "No accident of this magnitude occurs twice in one inquiry. Material evidence is being methodically eliminated." Despite the scale of the findings, public awareness remained limited. Local papers printed vague summaries under neutral headings such as "Ongoing Allegations" or "Charleston Inquiry Continues." Editors who attempted to print details faced withdrawal of advertising contracts from major trading firms associated with the implicated families. The Richmond Gazette, in its January 23, 1875 edition, published an unsigned notice. Reports of misconduct concerning charitable estates remain unsubstantiated. The Commission assures the public of continuing review. Internal letters later revealed that 2 journalists, Thomas Ellery and James Corbin, were dismissed after submitting articles referencing the demonstration directly. Their drafts were never recovered. Analysis of financial ledgers revealed a consistent pattern of deferred payments, often routed through intermediary institutions posing as charities or industrial education trusts. The Pendleton Fund, for example, listed disbursements for rural apprenticeship sponsorship, which investigators later connected to coded Blackwood transactions. The Wainwright Mercantile Company acted as the clearinghouse for several orders, processing payments in exchange for inventory transfers. Each payment slip corresponded to a date listed in Pierce's notes. Between 1869 and 1872, The Blackwood estate recorded revenue spikes inconsistent with cotton yields. Tax records show declared exports declining by 37%, while liquid reserves rose by 52%. This mismatch triggered federal scrutiny, but local assessors repeatedly filed, "No irregularity found." When federal auditors requested account access in 1875, they were informed that the ledgers had been destroyed in a minor fire. Coincidentally, this was the third such fire in connection with the investigation: Sullivan's barn, Norrell's cabin, and now the Blackwood archive room. What emerged from Pierce's accounts and subsequent documents was not an isolated crime, but an accepted mechanism. Those who attended the demonstration represented intersecting domains: law, medicine, commerce, and faith. They formed what later analysts termed the Southern Benevolent Circle, an informal coalition masking exploitation beneath reformist language. Minutes from a diocesan board meeting, July 1872, recorded Reverend Wallace Greer's statement: "Our duty lies in guiding the lesser and refining their purpose through discipline and observation." To contemporary readers, the phrase sounded paternal, even moral. In context, however, it validated the continued conditioning of children for private instruction, terminology drawn directly from the demonstration's records. When questioned by the Commission, Greer denied all involvement, stating that his attendance was ceremonial, yet financial entries under his name indicated receipt of $900 labeled institutional contribution. Following Pierce's testimony and mounting evidence, Federal Commissioner Alton Reeve authorized coordinated raids across 4 states: Virginia, Maryland, South Carolina, and Georgia. These operations began on August 14, 1875. Records from the Bureau of Internal Affairs document 17 properties searched. 11 yielded direct links to the Blackwood or Sullivan network. Among them were warehouses, plantation annexes, and transport depots containing forged indenture papers and coded ledgers. However, resistance persisted. Local sheriffs delayed warrants, citing procedural errors. In Savannah, Marshal Clark reported being detained by county officers for improper conduct. By the time release was secured, the targeted property had been cleared of all incriminating material. The Blackwood estate itself was raided last. When authorities arrived, they found the manor empty, ledgers missing, and several outbuildings reduced to ash. Witness statements confirmed that the fires began hours before the federal approach. The Commission's final summary, File 19B, 1876, classified the demonstration as the principal event illustrating systemic exploitation under guise of benevolence. Only one conviction followed: a minor clerk charged with falsifying contracts. All higher officials evaded prosecution through political influence or the convenient destruction of records. In its closing remarks, the committee concluded, "What began as an inquiry into orphan welfare revealed a structured commerce in human obedience. Its architects stood not in shadows, but in open daylight, protected by their own respectability." The demonstration was never mentioned again in Southern newspapers. Surviving documents were sealed under the Confidential Acts of 1878, only released in partial form in 1909. The testimonies surrounding the demonstration provided enough verified evidence to justify federal intervention, but even as warrants were issued, the network adapted. What investigators uncovered next shifted the inquiry from the rural estates to the urban institutions that financed them. Hidden among the salvaged ledgers lay a single signature: Wallace Greer, and the record of a new facility he had quietly established under the name St. Augustine House of Virtue. In early 1834, following the depositions of Samuel Pierce and the recovery of Blackwood's surviving ledgers, the Federal Marshal's Office initiated a series of synchronized raids across Virginia and Maryland. The first occurred on March 3rd at a rural property near Frederick County. According to the field records preserved in the Bureau of Internal Security archive, 17 officers were dispatched under warrant authorization signed by Judge Hallenby of Baltimore. The operation lasted 7 hours. 41 children were recovered from subterranean quarters beneath the main barn structure. Their names, approximate ages, and assigned codes were later cross-referenced with entries in the Sullivan Blackwood Manifest recovered months earlier. Each entry corresponded with a recorded financial transaction in Ledger B23, confirming that the Frederick estate had been one of the principal storage and transit points in the network. Subsequent raids on March the 6th and March 8th targeted smaller holdings in Charles County, Maryland, and Fauquier County, Virginia. Reports from these actions note varying degrees of resistance. In Fauquier, local constables refused participation, citing jurisdictional uncertainty. Federal officers proceeded without them, supported instead by 3 enlisted soldiers from Fort Monroe. 18 children were found confined in an abandoned tobacco-drying house. The walls were lined with heavy iron rings bolted to beams, matching descriptions in Pierce's testimony of the containment design used throughout Blackwood's properties. 7 adults were taken into custody, 4 identified as hired guards, 2 as buyers awaiting transfer papers, and 1 as an intermediary known only as H. McTavish, whose signature appeared repeatedly in the seized correspondence. The resistance to these interventions intensified with each subsequent operation. Between March 12th and March 20th, warrants were met with delays, files vanished from county offices, and officers reported being shadowed by unknown riders. On March 14th, Deputy Webb, assigned to the Richmond Division, was attacked while transporting confiscated evidence. His wagon was found overturned on the Lynchburg Road. The sealed chest containing the Sullivan records was missing for 48 hours before being discovered in a burned shed 5 miles away. All paper within had been destroyed. Webb survived but carried multiple injuries consistent with blunt force assault. His formal statement, archived in the Federal Inquiry Ledger, was the first to document organized retaliation against investigators by parties unknown but presumed to be associates of the former proprietors. The death of Constance Sullivan occurred the same week. She had been confined in the Charleston County Jail under protective custody pending testimony. The official report listed her cause of death as self-inflicted by hanging using a strip of cloth from her bedding. However, inspection by attending physician Dr. Klein noted bruising inconsistent with suspension alone, marks along the wrists and shoulders indicating restraint. Jail records from that night revealed gaps. No guard logs between 2:10 a.m. and 3:45 a.m., and the key to her cell missing until recovered the following afternoon. The coroner's inquest was inconclusive. Her death effectively ended the possibility of direct testimony linking Blackwood's buyers to the Charleston Medical College. Despite these losses, operations continued under federal supervision. On March 22nd, a major action in Albemarle County uncovered the largest site yet. The estate, registered to an absentee owner under the alias H. Brandt, spanned nearly 600 acres and contained multiple outbuildings. Beneath the west granary, investigators discovered narrow cells built of brick and timber. Within them, 53 miners were found alive, ages ranging from 5 to 15. The inventory report listed clothing remnants, medical implements, and ledgers of purchases written in cipher. When decoded by the Bureau cryptographer 2 months later, these records corresponded to 187 financial transfers between 1829 and 1834, with individual subjects identified by descriptive terms rather than names. The ciphered columns denoted condition, durability, and suitability, reflecting a systematic classification of children for sale and exploitation. On April 1st, coordinated raids were launched across 5 counties simultaneously, an unprecedented move authorized by Federal Directive 12C. Participation included 39 federal agents and 72 deputized marshals. The objective? To dismantle remaining auction depots and secure documentary proof of organized trade routes. Over 3 days, 112 children were recovered, alongside 28 adult detainees implicated in trafficking, concealment, or documentation falsification. Among the materials seized were handwritten contracts between plantation owners and intermediary brokers, most stipulating acquisition and training clauses that matched entries in earlier Blackwood contracts. Financial analysis conducted later in the year revealed that the child trade had operated as a self-sustaining economy, with profit margins exceeding standard agricultural labor exchanges by 46%. Resistance from local authorities remained pronounced. In Culpeper, the tone of all surviving documentation remains consistently factual, devoid of sentiment or interpretation. The report of Federal Marshal Operations, Southern Division, presents its findings as a sequence of numbered entries, describing not moral outrage but logistics, the dimensions of holding rooms, the weight of seized ledgers, the denominations of currency counted at confiscated auction tables. Yet between those lines, the structure of a hidden economy emerges with chilling clarity. It was not a spontaneous crime, but a coordinated system maintained through wealth, complicity, and silence. Following the final operations, confiscated materials were transported to Washington under seal. The ledgers, correspondence, and coded papers were archived as sensitive evidence, Case 47A, stored in the Department of War records for nearly 3 decades before being declassified. Inspection of these papers, decades later, would reveal consistent entries linking medical professionals, shipping brokers, and plantation owners through shared initials and symbols. Despite repeated attempts to reopen the case, most implicated parties remained beyond prosecution due to destroyed documentation or statute limitations. By year's end, the official count stood at 112 recovered victims, 17 confirmed dead, and an unknown number unaccounted for. The raids had dismantled the immediate network but failed to expose its full reach. Many estates previously identified in Sullivan's notes were found abandoned or razed, their owners relocated or untraceable. Newspapers continued to refer obliquely to child indenture irregularities, while omitting the involvement of established families. The silence following those months became its own form of resistance, an institutional refusal to acknowledge what had been unearthed. In that silence, the investigation's record remains the only surviving testament. A figure, date, and coordinate preserved within the files marks the residue of a concealed enterprise. The operations that recovered children from basements and barns were recorded not as rescues, but as asset retrievals. The victims, anonymized by the system that commodified them, appear only as entries: child, male, approximately 7 years, child, female, approximately 10 years, without further note. The preservation of those records, rather than the prosecutions that followed, constitutes the investigation's sole enduring legacy. Thus ended the documented phase of resistance and retaliation. What began as a local inquiry into missing children had become a national reckoning rendered in bureaucratic language. Every witness lost, every corrupted warrant, and every destroyed file contributes to the historical texture of an event whose brutality is captured not in emotion, but in enumeration. The case files remain a ledger of what can be proven and of what was deliberately erased. The judicial proceedings that followed the dismantling of the Blackwood network began in the summer of 1835 and extended over 6 years, concluding formally in 1841 with the death of Henry Blackwood in federal custody. Records from the Richmond and Charleston circuit courts, preserved in fragmentary form, indicate that 37 indictments were issued under varying charges: kidnapping, unlawful confinement, conspiracy, and homicide. Of these, only 14 resulted in trial, and 5 led to conviction. The rest were dismissed, deferred, or quietly dissolved through procedural maneuvering. Blackwood's trial commenced on December 9, 1835, in Charleston, under federal jurisdiction following his transfer from local custody. The indictment charged him with 8 counts of murder, 23 counts of unlawful confinement, and multiple charges of conspiracy to traffic minors across state lines. The evidence presented by federal prosecutors relied heavily on the ledgers seized from his estate and the testimony of Samuel Pierce, whose depositions became central to the case. Physical evidence included instruments retrieved from the experimental quarters, documented in court as implements of medical cruelty, and personal correspondence linking Blackwood to physicians from Charleston Medical College. Transcripts of the proceedings show a rigid adherence to factual presentation. Witnesses recounted numbers, not emotions, dates, not impressions. The court stenographer's notes record Pierce describing the rooms in which children were restrained and the orders issued by Blackwood for their conditioning. His words were received in silence, interrupted only by defense objections claiming lack of direct proof of Blackwood's personal involvement. The jury deliberated for 11 hours before returning a verdict of guilty on 4 counts of murder and all counts of unlawful confine. Blackwood was sentenced to life imprisonment. His petition for appeal was denied in 1837. He died in his cell at Fort Moultrie Prison on February 2, 1841, recorded officially as heart failure. 2 Charleston physicians, identified in records as Dr. L. P. Garrison and Dr. Asa Morton, were tried separately in 1836 under federal authority for complicity in human experimentation and conspiracy to conceal evidence. Proceedings from the South Carolina Medical Review Board corroborate that both were found guilty of professional misconduct. The board voted unanimously to revoke their medical licenses. Court transcripts from June 1836 detail how the physicians justified their participation as empirical observation for the advancement of tropical medicine. The jury rejected the defense, convicting both men on charges of unlawful experimentation and manslaughter. Each received a 10-year sentence, served at the Richmond Penitentiary. Upon release, neither returned to medical practice. Of the numerous investors and landowners implicated through financial ledgers, fewer than half faced trial. 21 individuals were named in the 1837 Federal Inquiry Report as beneficiaries of unregistered property transfers involving minors. Among these were several members of established families in Charleston, Savannah, and Norfolk. 7 fled abroad before formal charges, 3 to England, 2 to Cuba, 1 to France, and 1 unaccounted for. Extradition requests were filed in 1838, but dismissed for lack of jurisdiction. The remaining defendants faced charges reduced to illegal trade or failure to report unlawful activity, resulting in fines and property forfeiture rather than imprisonment. Newspaper coverage during the trials reflected both fascination and discomfort. The Charleston Daily Courier published detailed accounts of the courtroom proceedings, though often omitting reference to the medical experiments. The Richmond Gazette, in its June 12, 1836 issue, reported that the testimony has uncovered the existence of institutions operating beyond the reach of moral restraint. Federal bulletins released later that year corroborated public unease, but maintained bureaucratic neutrality, referring to the crimes as violations of emerging standards of human custody. Editorials across the North and South debated whether the events constituted isolated atrocities or evidence of a systemic failure in law and governance. Official records of the United States Senate hearing of 1837, archived under docket 1452, contain testimony from federal agents describing the obstruction they faced at local levels. The hearings led to the introduction of the Child Protection and Custody Act, passed by Virginia's General Assembly in early 1838. This legislation prohibited the trade or transfer of minors without court certification and required registration of all apprenticeship contracts. Historians later identified this as the earliest formal child protection law in the southern states. Further inquiry into the network's financial dimensions continued until 1840, overseen by the Department of Treasury's Special Committee. Their 1840 report estimated that the operation's annual turnover had exceeded $120,000, a substantial sum for the period. The report concluded that the trafficking system had functioned through established banking intermediaries with coded deposits labeled as agricultural exports. Despite the documentation, no banks were penalized. All implicated institutions cited clerical ignorance of account nature. Constance Sullivan's death remained officially classified as suicide. Although several witnesses suggested foul play, no investigation was reopened. Her estate, consisting of seized documents and personal correspondence, was transferred to federal custody. In the records of the 1839 inquiry, her name appears in passing. Deceased, formerly involved in conveyance of minors. The omission of her broader role reflected both administrative detachment and deliberate minimization of her significance in the scandal. Survivors of the trafficking network were placed under the supervision of religious charities and orphan asylums. The report of the Charleston Refuge Board, 1842, lists 67 minors recovered from unlawful custody and presently housed in institutional care. Their fates afterward remain largely undocumented. Only 12 were ever traced into adulthood through census records of 1850. Government memoranda classified the case as closed in 1843, with no further prosecutions recommended. Despite its limited convictions, the Blackwood case altered federal oversight of child welfare. The exposure of medical involvement and interstate trade forced Congress to authorize the first federal anti-trafficking statutes, enacted as part of the Criminal Reform Act of 1840. The statute criminalized the interstate sale or confinement of minors for experimentation or servitude, and authorized federal jurisdiction in such crimes. While its enforcement was sporadic, its passage signaled an acknowledgement of the crime's scope and the state's prior failure to address them. Public memory of the case faded quickly. By the late 1840s, few newspapers revisited the story, and official archives were transferred to the Department of Justice under restricted classification. The remaining documents, trial transcripts, depositions, and court exhibits were catalogued as Southern Criminal Proceedings, Series 4, stored in the Washington archives. Examination of those papers in the 20th century confirmed the authenticity of the original records, but revealed significant omissions, entire pages missing from the transcript of Blackwood's sentencing, and an unexplained gap in the clerk's log between the testimony of Dr. Morton and the reading of the final verdict. Blackwood's death certificate, preserved in prison archives, listed no family contact or correspondence. His estate was seized and auctioned by federal order. Proceeds were directed toward the Charleston Refuge Board. The inventory of confiscated goods lists medical instruments, ledgers, and 112 pieces of domestic furniture, each item tagged as evidence before its sale. No marker or grave record for Blackwood remains. His name appears only in the closing line of the 1841 registry. Deceased. Case terminated. By the time the last appeals concluded, most participants had dispersed or vanished. Of the investigators involved, several resigned, citing exhaustion and threats. Others were reassigned to unrelated duties. The files of Marshal Henry Carver, the lead investigator, end with a single notation dated November 1842. Case fully prosecuted to limits of evidence, further pursuit unadvised. The bureaucratic phrasing belied the scale of what had transpired, but it preserved the official tone of finality. Though reduced in the public record to columns of figures and legal phrasing, the trials forced a reluctant recognition that the crimes were not anomalies. They revealed an infrastructure of exploitation embedded within respectability, a system that had functioned through law itself. The convictions, limited as they were, formalized an end to the network's operations. Yet the judicial outcome remained incomplete, the survivors unacknowledged beyond institutional care, and the perpetrators largely shielded by position and wealth. The documents that remain, witness testimonies, sentencing ledgers, and federal summaries, constitute the entirety of the preserved narrative. There is no moral commentary, no editorial voice, only the detached precision of bureaucracy, cataloguing events it could neither comprehend nor repair. The trials exposed the machinery of atrocity, recorded in ink, certified by seal, and concluded in silence. By 1845, the formal record of what came to be known as the Sullivan Case had closed, yet its consequences extended far beyond the courtroom and the confiscated estates. The files that once lay in the Richmond archives migrated slowly through the bureaucratic chain, from county records to state archives, and finally to federal custody in Washington. But in that process, the case became more than a set of legal precedents. It became a point of reference. Newspaper columns, legal pamphlets, and social reform lectures began to use the term a Sullivan case to describe any instance of systemic neglect or exploitation involving children. The phrase carried a weight that law itself had failed to express, a symbol of what could grow, unseen, in the space between silence and authority. The physical remnants of the Sullivan property were removed within a year of the final trial. The house was dismantled plank by plank, its cellar filled and sealed beneath layers of lime and stone. On the remaining land, a burial ground was established at county expense. 31 graves, marked only by initials drawn from ledger references, were recorded in the clerk's list of 1843 as unnamed minors recovered during investigation. No ceremony accompanied the act. Over time, the site became a small cemetery, visited occasionally by families tracing names found in orphanage registers, but seldom finding answers. By 1860, the markers had weathered into anonymity, and the exact boundaries of the burial ground were lost. In the years following, public institutions began to change their methods of record-keeping and oversight. The General Assembly of Virginia issued the 1838 Custodial Welfare Mandate, requiring inspection of all orphanages, almshouses, and asylums twice annually by independent magistrates. Similar measures appeared in Maryland and North Carolina. By 1842, 7 southern states had introduced legislation mandating written consent for the relocation of minors between counties. These laws marked the first systematic effort to track the welfare of children under public or private care. Federal recognition of these changes came in the form of the 1840 Criminal Reform Act, whose third clause specifically prohibited the transfer of minors for unregulated labor or medical purposes. Medical institutions too responded, some defensively, others in quiet reform. Charleston Medical College, whose faculty had been implicated during the inquiry, released a formal statement in 1839 condemning non-consensual human experimentation. Although the language was measured, it represented one of the earliest public acknowledgments of ethical boundaries in American medical practice. By mid-century, professional boards in several states had adopted oaths requiring written consent for participation in experimental studies. The precedent stemmed directly from the Sullivan Case hearings, though official histories seldom credited it. The social reform movements that emerged in the 1840s and 1850s frequently cited the case as a warning. In Boston, abolitionist publications reprinted excerpts from the trial transcripts to argue that exploitation was not limited to slavery, but could thrive wherever power met secrecy. Religious periodicals in Philadelphia and Baltimore turned the story into sermons on moral vigilance. Even as the details blurred with retelling, the case maintained a symbolic force. The image of the sealed basement, the forgotten children, the respectable names behind closed doors. For the survivors, however, there was no legislation or public debate that could restore what had been taken. Census records from 1850 identify 12 individuals traced from the recovered group, each listed without family names, labeled as houseworkers, apprentices, or dependents. Only 3 left written statements, preserved in charitable society archives. One, signed R.B. and dated 1857, describes recurring dreams of rooms without windows and the sound of chains removed but not forgotten. While the language suggests deep psychological distress, the record preserves it without comment, filed between donation receipts and school attendance reports. Rebecca, the girl whose memory had opened the investigation, appears once more in the documentation, listed in an 1849 report by the Virginia Refuge Committee as a sewing instructor for younger wards. The notation ends abruptly after that year. No record of her death or marriage exists. Her name does not appear in the 1850 census, though a letter from a committee supervisor mentions her departure for northern employment. The tone of the correspondence is administrative, devoid of sentiment, as though recording the movement of an account rather than a life. Nationally, the Sullivan Case's influence reached legislative circles long after its immediate memory had faded from newspapers. The 1853 Federal Child Custody Review Bill, debated in Congress, drew language directly from the 1840 Act and included references to the precedents of 1835 to 1841. During the debate, Senator Thomas Wade of Ohio remarked that the lessons of Virginia's tragedy prove that law without oversight breeds its own silence. The bill passed with amendments 2 years later, forming the foundation for the early child welfare offices that later evolved into federal protective agencies. Public memory continued to evolve independently of the Ark. Hives. By the late 19th century, local folklore in Virginia recast the Sullivan property as a site of haunting. Travelers spoke of hearing voices near the buried cellar. Writers of the 1890s transformed the story into moral fiction, often stripping it of context and reducing its details to allegory. The original documents, meanwhile, lay forgotten in government storage until their partial rediscovery in 1931 by archivist Helen Burroughs, who catalogued them under miscellaneous criminal proceedings. Her annotations in the margin describe the material as disturbing in tone but valuable to early social history. The practical consequences of the case endured in subtle but measurable ways. The Department of Interior's 1870 report on institutional reforms credited the Sullivan investigation as an early catalyst for federal inspection authority. Medical ethics committees formed in 1865, citing the Charleston precedent, made explicit reference to the reforms born from the scandal. Even the terminology of custodial welfare originated in those early mandates. What had begun as a local tragedy became the blueprint for national accountability, slowly, imperfectly, but undeniably. Yet for all its influence on law and policy, the human cost remained irrecoverable. No compensation was ever recorded for the survivors. Their lives unfolded in silence, absorbed into the ordinary anonymity of the 19th century. Churches that once served as shelters never listed their names in baptismal or marriage ledgers. The absence itself became the legacy, an archival void standing as proof of the event's reality. By the early 20th century, the term Sullivan Case had shifted again in meaning. Legal textbooks used it to illustrate the necessity of evidence preservation and cross-jurisdictional cooperation. Social reformers invoked it as shorthand for institutional failure. To the few historians who re-examined the files, it remained an emblem of how atrocity could hide beneath paperwork, how law could function both as tool and veil. The final government reference appears in the 1924 compilation Federal Crimes of the 19th Century, which summarized the episode in 5 lines. In 1834, the Sullivan and Blackwood estates were discovered to have engaged in unlawful confinement of minors. Subsequent reforms established oversight in child custody and medical practice. No further elaboration followed. In its reduction to a sentence, the event reached its bureaucratic conclusion. Today, the site of the Sullivan Farm is an open field bordered by oak trees and unmarked earth. Archaeological surveys conducted in 1972 confirmed the presence of the filled cellar and fragments of iron consistent with restraints. A bronze plaque placed nearby reads simply, "Memorial to the Lost Children, 1834. Few visitors recognize the name, but the echo of the record persists. In every statute concerning child welfare, in every inspection form demanding verification of consent, the lineage of that tragedy endures. The Sullivan case proved that exploitation could exist not in shadows, but in the very structures meant to prevent it. It revealed how legality could mask cruelty until documented fact forced acknowledgement. The case reshaped the boundaries of accountability, embedding in the nation's laws an enduring awareness that oversight is the only barrier between order and atrocity. The basement in Virginia was sealed and the earth reclaimed, yet its silence remains a record of what had been buried. So, the case endures as both warning and foundation, an emblem of vigilance born from horror, preserved not by those who spoke of it, but by the institutions compelled to ensure it would never recur. The Sullivan case remains more than a chapter of history. It is evidence of what happens when silence becomes protection for the guilty. The laws that followed were written in the memory of those who were never found. To uncover more histories the world chose to forget. Subscribe to Forgotten Chronicles.